Hi there. So today I'm going to talk about FOSCAM Internet IP cameras. Basically, these are Wi-Fi based or Ethernet based IP cameras. You can buy them in a variety of shapes and form factors, and they're pretty inexpensive and they're pretty popular. So one of the issues with these cameras, though, is while they're not necessarily designed to communicate directly to the internet, to say a cloud DVR like a drop cam, they do have some abilities to do that, but typically they're designed just to be used inside of your house. You might want to do you could connect to them remotely, with some configuration using an app on your phone. But generally they're just home network ones, not cloud enabled. Now, one of the things is that they are made by a Chinese company. And that in of itself is not necessarily a problem. It's just that it's been kind of come to light that the firmware on these does some strange things that just doesn't seem right. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what I did to secure these. And these are just guidelines, and they may not apply to all of these cameras, but I have a couple different kinds, and they all seem to do it. So I think this will generally work pretty well. So the first thing to do is essentially in the web UI for the camera. So if you have multiple cameras, you got to do this for each one. You need to do a couple things. You want to right away make sure you go under network. You basically want to go to IP configuration and make sure you're using a static IP address. Don't let it just have DHCP on your network. You should assign it a static range. That way the camera doesn't move around, so you can always find it. As you can see, this camera here, I have it configured for 25. And the gateway and the DNS points to my router at home. If you're using wireless, make sure the wireless is configured with encryption. That's nothing to do with this camera. That's just your wireless network. DNS option is dynamic DNS, and you should make sure that's turned off. I don't think it's enabled by default, but definitely uncheck that. If you're going to use dynamic DNS, you should do it on your router or some other way. Don't do it on the camera. UPnP is the next one, and I recall this was enabled by default. This should definitely be turned off. What this does is UPnP stands for Universal Plug and Play. It's a silly name. What it really means is that when you plug a network device into your network and when you have a home router, it is actually able to open up the port forwarding automatically. So when you enable this, what happens is the camera connects to your router and it actually adds a port forwarding line into your firewall or your router without asking you. So essentially what that means is you need to turn off the UPnP in here. Mail and FTP settings, this is stuff you can do yourself. And the last one you should be touching here is P2P. Now, I disabled this, and there's this UID, and I think this peer-to-peer, P2P stands for peer-to-peer, and it allows you to connect the camera to other cameras. I actually don't even really know what this is for, but I don't like the sound of it, so I shut it off. And after doing some reading, it sounds like even when this is off, it's still turned on. This setting is broken. It doesn't seem to affect it. And the way you can tell is if you run TinyCam or similar app on your phone to allow you to look at the cameras, the phone is able to see the P2P still running. So anyways, I turned it off. I recommend you do that as well. Okay, so next thing you need to do is change the username on your password. I think that's under basic settings, and you go under user accounts. So you should never leave the standard username and password on these cameras. I think it's just admin and there's just a no password, it's blank. And I think it makes you type in a password the first time you log in, but I absolutely say you should absolutely not leave the username as admin, because what happens is, say someone does gain access to your camera, if it's admin, which is the stock password, they're going to have an easy time trying to guess your password because they already know the username. But if you change the username, and this camera is called camera 2, and then you use a password that is not just a word like camera or password, you should use letters and numbers and special symbols. Make the password a little more difficult to guess. So absolutely you should do this. Do not leave the stock username, and and then use a good password. If we look at live video, we can see that this camera here is actually working. It's the one that is sitting right next to my computer here. All right, so basically that's it. So to summarize, change your username and password, change the port numbers, make sure you're using the HTTPS when you're connecting to the camera. That would be here, HTTPS, and that. Don't connect over the normal HTTP connection. That's unencrypted. That would allow someone to sniff your password and username, which you don't want to do. So only ever use HTTPS. Disable the UPnP and disable the P2P. That's that weird P2P setting in here that does its thing. Okay. Next thing is I want to talk about firewalling. What this is this is a Splunk instance, and essentially I have this ASUS router at home, and I log all of the connectivity, like any connection that goes through it, either direction, I have logging. So I'm able to look at my firewall logs at home basically. And I noticed with these cameras, they do all sorts of shenanigans. As soon as you boot up, there's a bunch of TCP communication outbound to the internet, and then once they're running, you have a whole bunch of UDP communication happening. I saw traffic on port 10,001, I saw port 21047, and I saw port 10240. This is all UDP traffic. I also saw port 123 on UDP, but that's normal because that is basically the camera is trying to communicate to the time servers out on the internet so it could set its internal clock. I also saw a bunch of UDP TCP connections, which is like what a web browser would use when you load a web page. I saw port 80, 443, and a couple other ports as well, and this all happened on boot. So what I wanted to do is actually block all the outbound traffic on the internet for my camera, because I feel personally that my camera should not be communicating with the internet, and I think you should too. And what I mean is communicating outbound from your camera to things on the internet without you asking it to do it. Obviously, if I set up my camera to set its clock, internal clock automatically using NTP, Network Time Protocol, then I expect to see traffic from the camera to the NTP servers. But I don't expect to see anything else going out. And I personally have a real problem with that. I want my camera to be only communicating to what I want it to communicate to. So what I decided to do was use my router to block the outbound communication. Now, this is unfortunately where I can't really show how to set it up. So I have an ASUS RT-AC68R router, and basically it has this web interface here which allows you to do some stuff. So one of the things it does is it has an option under, if I go under advanced settings and I click on firewall, then basically up at the top here you pick network service filter. That allows you to set up rules that block the outbound traffic. So at first, when I started experimenting with it, this is the stuff I have in here right now, I created a rule that it basically said anything from my camera, which say this camera is, the IP is 10.00.25, I said anything from this camera on to the internet, I want to block it. So the first port I put in, first block rule I put in was this one at the bottom here. I mean, I've changed this around because I've been experimenting, but I had it blocking all the UDP traffic. So port 1, so the way it works is up at the top here, you put the source IP address in, which is going to be your camera. You can only do one at a time. So on this router at least. So I put in 10.00, I'll just type it in just to give you an example, 25. Okay, you leave the port range blank and you leave the destination IP blank. That just means you're talking about from this address on your network to anything on the internet. And then you put the port range in. So if you want to block all UDP traffic, you pick UDP under protocol here. And then here you put 1:65535. That's the entire range of ports. And then you push this plus button. And what that does is it adds it to the list. And what that says is my firewall will block all outbound traffic from port 1 to 65,035 on UDP protocol. And I wanted to do that because remember I told you I saw port 10240, port 21047, and port 10,001 being all used, and I don't know what those are doing, so I'm just going to block them. So what I first did, I just put this in, just this line. I didn't add any other blocks. I just was blocking UDP. And what happened is when I rebooted the camera, basically it booted up and I was able to get to the web interface, but then it started acting very weird. Like the video stream would start to play, like I'd get a little bit of video for a second and then the video would go black and it would stop working. And then the web interface would kind of freeze up and not work properly. And I'm like, what is happening here? Well, I don't know to be honest, I don't know what's happening. But essentially, what I found is as soon as I blocked the TCP traffic, and this is this bottom line here, 10.00.25, 1 to 65.35 on UD. Oh, that's UDP. This one up here. This is the one where I'm blocking 1 to 65,035 on TCP. What this does is as soon as the camera boots up, and I can show you, this is Splunk here. These are my firewall logs. So this is the camera booting up here. Well, actually, this sort of does it periodically anyway. So we have the source. It's a bit hard to see on the camera, so I apologize. But it's saying source is 10.00.25. Destination is some random address on the internet, 74.125.31.99. And then the port, source port, destination port 80. So this is a TCP connection basically on port 80. And the camera is trying to connect to it. Well, what my firewall is doing now is it's dropping it. And I see port 80, I see port 8000, I see port 443 and 80 and 80. Yeah, so it just does a bunch of stuff. So as soon as I started putting that drop rule in for TCP, not UDP, for TCP, which is this one right here, TCP on all these ports, when the camera boots up, it first starts checking those ports and the firewall just drops them. And I think what happens at that point is the camera assumes that it's not connected to the internet. It knows it's on a network, it's on my internal network, but it's trying to check to see if it can reach these servers. And as soon as it can't, it goes, oh, I guess I'm not on the internet, so I give up. So basically, I guess I'm not going to try and do anything internet, centric. I'm just going to work as a camera on my network. So what happens is I notice once I put that in, even though I have a rule in here blocking the UDP traffic, it's at the bottom here, is actually not doing anything. I don't see any UDP ports in my firewall logs anymore. When I go back to Splunk, as long as I'm blocking the TCP on boot, it stops trying to check UDP. Unfortunately, there's a side effect. And the side effect is, let's see here, we're going to go back to the camera here. So we're in the camera interface here again. And when we go to basic settings, right here, basic settings, and we go to camera time, this is where you want the camera to check the internet to get the time automatically because you want the camera to be correct. Well, see how it says sync with NTP server? If you turn that on, like here, and right now this is not going to work because time.nis.cov is going to try to talk on UDP port 110.23. Well, if you remember in my firewall, I'm blocking that port, so that's not going to work. But I can go down here and I can click ... and it allows me to type in my own address. So I can put in my own server, for instance. That's not the address, but I can put my server address in. And what that allows me to do is have the camera synchronized to my own personal file server here at home. It's a Linux box, and get the time that way. And that works. As soon as I check that, it does it. I can look at the server and I can see that the camera's communicated to it and pull the time. Where the problem happens, as soon as I reboot this camera, this is unchecked and it goes back to just basically local time where it looks like this, or you could set the time yourself. That's the problem. Is as soon as the camera reboots, tries to communicate on TCP and is blocked, it then assumes it's not on the internet. So it just says, well, I can't check the time on the internet with this NTP server if I'm not on the internet, so it just unchecks it. Even though I'm telling it to check my internal server, which isn't even on the internet, it just unchecks it. And incidentally, if you adjust your firewall to allow this to communicate directly to the internet for the time, it doesn't matter. As soon as you reboot, it's gone. Clearly, it's using the it's using the TCP rules when it boots up to check to see if it's on the internet, and if it determines it's not, there you go. So, unfortunately, guys, the long story short is, as soon as you block the camera from accessing the internet with TCP, you are no longer able to set the time automatically. And there's really no way around that. If you want this to work, you're going to have to allow the camera to communicate on TCP and UDP. Because if you block the UDP without the TCP, it won't boot properly. If you block the TCP and the UDP, then basically it boots fine, but then it doesn't set the time. Now, that would be a problem for most, but I actually have something I can do about it. I have a FOSCAM network video recorder, and it's a DVR basically. I have another video about it if you look at my videos. It's a little box that has a hard drive, and it records all of my cameras at home onto the hard drive, so I can go back and look at the footage and stuff like that. Now, this has a very similar interface. You can look at this, it looks exactly like the camera, but it's different because it behaves slightly differently. Now, if you look here, I'm on the screen where it's showing the NTP settings. So this is where this is basically automatically synchronized with Internet Time Server, and see it's checked, and the NTP and then NTP server is set for time.nist.gov. That's like a U.S. government, central time server. Now, it has an option right above here, synchronize time to camera. So what happens is when the network video recorder has a time set, it will automatically push that time into the cameras automatically. So even though the cameras have, aren't able to communicate to the internet, and they have that checkbox that NTP is unchecked, my network video recorder will automatically set their time. And I found that this actually works. So even though my network video recorder is being blocked in the firewall from all internet access, just like the camera, it's like I have a TCP block rule for all the ports, and I have a UDP block rule for all the ports, except I have an exception. I'm blocking between port 1 to 122 and 124 to 65,035. And what that does is two separate rules, right? So when I have the rules set like that, there's a gap of port 123, and that allows this time server to work. And this is able to set the time, and this is able to synchronize the time to the camera. And even though I'm blocking all of those TCP ports, when I reboot this thing, the DVR, or the network video recorder, it does not uncheck this setting. So unlike the camera, which as soon as it can't reach the internet, it goes, I can't set the time, I give up, this doesn't do it. So luckily for me, because I have this and I only have 4 cameras and they're connected to this box, I can totally block all the ports on my camera. And then I can just rely on the network video recorder here to set the time on the cameras. And also, as a side note, when I go into Splunk, if I look at the network video recorder, there we go, 30. So my network video recorder is 30. So what we're looking at here, this is all the allows or the drops. So this is everything my DVR is doing. And all I can see is basically the DVR talking to some IP address on port 123. So it's setting its clock basically, and it's doing it because I'm allowing it to do it. When I do a reboot, it definitely has some TCP communication that's all dropped because I'm blocking it. But luckily, this continues to work. So I'm okay. For regular people, if you want your camera to work, you unfortunately don't have a lot of choice. Basically, like I said, if you block the camera from communicating on UDP, but you leave the TCP, then it basically will just crash and not work properly. And I don't have any idea how accurate the camera is on here, so you may or may not be able to rely on it to keep accurate time. Anyhow, so anyways, those are my tips for securing this. Oh, let me talk a little bit about the port forwarding. So if you go into your router and you do want to allow port forwarding so you can access these remotely, but essentially here's how it works. You have your camera, okay? And we're going to say the camera is 10.0.0.1, and the web interface, say the HTTP interface is 8000, and the HTTPS, which is the encrypted, is 8001. So I'll just write HTTP here. Okay, and you have a router here. We're going to call this router. And of course, we have the internet down here. So what you're going to want to do is create a rule. You find look in your router. You'll find a place for port forwarding. But what I advise is don't use these ports. Use something really high. So the way it'll look basically is it will say something like this. It'll say the source. And we're going to say source port is actually what it's going to say. And we're going to say, I'm going to advise you use something like 59128. I mean, that's just an example, but basically it can be anything It has to be something below 6535. So any port below 6535, but it should be way up there, and it should be something just random that, you know, nothing else is using. So we're going to say source port, and then what happens is you say, and then it will have destination, I'm going to abbreviate that, IP, and destination port, PT. So source port 59128, destination IP, we're going to say 10.0.0.1, because that's the address of my internal camera, and the destination port, we're going to use this HTTPS one, so 8001. So what this means, everyone, is when you have a computer out here on the internet, you know, talks to the internet, when this computer in its web browser goes HTTPS and it types in the IP address of your home internet connection. So remember, you have to use dynamic DNS unless you have a static IP. But let's just say you have a static IP and it's 4.5.6.7. You would write HTTPS : / 4.5.6.7 : right? And I'm sorry, I have to wrap around, but this would be on the same line in your web browser. It'd be : 59128. What that would say is it'll instruct your computer to go and talk to your router on port 59128, but when the router receives that port forwarding rule you set up in the web user interface in your router is going to say, oh, any traffic I see to 49128, forward it or send it to 10.0.0.1 on port 8001, which of course is your camera. So it's a very high port, so it's kind of less, you know, common. Like, people aren't going to just stumble onto it as easily. They're going to have to scan everything. And what will happen as soon as you do this is the web user interface for your camera comes up, which of course means that you have changed the username and password, right? So when that pops up, the username is not going to be admin. It's going to be something different, something unique, and then the password is going to be, you know, whatever you've done that's complex. I still don't really recommend doing this. If you can get away not doing port forwarding, it's better, it's safer, because who knows how safe these devices actually are. You know, there might be flaws. If someone were able to break into your camera, not only can they see inside of your house, well, they might be able to take advantage of the operating system on the camera and also access other things inside of your house. They could, like, maybe see your other cameras, or they could, like, get access to your devices or your computers that are running at home. It's not always a good idea to do port forwarding. It's a bit complex, but some routers allow you to set up a VPN connection, and you can do it from iPhone or Android, and essentially it's a safer way to access your home network. But anyways, I think some of this might help you, you know, secure your device a little bit, and it gives you a little heads up on how the port blocking works with these FOSCAMs. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you think this is helpful at all, please give me a thumbs up, put some comments in there. I will answer any questions you have. Thanks, bye.